America is tightening its borders, choosing who belongs and who doesn't.
Early morning raids in Chicago.
They are getting arrested.
Trump's promised crackdown on irregular migration has sparked controversy.
People are very afraid.
Immigration is treated almost like a crime here in the U.S.
It's a disgusting, dehumanizing way. We don't view as people essentially to work these hard labor jobs and then persecute them with ICE and the police.
And America is kind of built off immigrants.
While some immigrant families face separation and detention without trial, other families are welcomed, granted fast-track resettlement under the banner of persecution.
The president made it clear that Afrikaners in South Africa who were the victims of unjust racial discrimination would be welcome to come to the United States.
So how did the US get here? To understand if the US immigration system has been racist from the beginning, we must look at the complexity of how the United States of America came to be. In 1775, Britain's American colonies launched a war of independence that lasted ultimately until 1783. But as early as July 4, 1776, the 13 American colonies formally declared their separation from Britain. Later that year, they adopted the name United States of America. After America finally gained independence from Britain, loyalty to the new nation mattered more than birthplace or parentage.
In the early days of the United States, citizenship involved being a white male landowner, which wasn't so great for the women and the people who weren't white and the people who didn't own land. So, of course, you had Southern farmers starting to bring in slaves from Africa, also not the happiest part of our history or the happiest circumstances of immigration. It wasn't until later on in America's history that we started seeing more immigration from other parts of Europe.
If you supported the US, you could become a full citizen. This applied to former British citizens who supported the revolution and became American citizens. Germans, the French, and other Northern Europeans were also allowed into the newly formed nation. In 1790, Congress passed the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said only free white people who were considered good or of good character could become US citizens. They also had to have lived in the US for at least 2 years and swear loyalty to the country. The law, however, excluded indentured servants, non-whites, and slaves from naturalization. In the same year, the very first census in the US was conducted, but it excluded Native Americans. It revealed that the United States population had grown significantly since the 1770s, reaching roughly 3.9 million residents. The census also showed that about 80.7% of the United States population was white, while the remainder 19.3% were almost all African slaves. In 1785, Thomas Jefferson pointed out that although he had concerns about immigration, this was the only way to make the country grow economically.
The present desire of America is to produce rapid population by as great importations of foreigners as possible.
Until the 1880s, most of the immigrants came from Western Europe. Slowly, the number of immigrants from Eastern Europe and the Americas began to grow.
There also were prejudices against different shades of white, which we don't tend to see as much anymore. And there was a lot of discrimination against Southern Europeans, against Slavs, against Jews, against Italians.
The California Gold Rush, which began in 1848, saw a lot of Chinese immigrants come to work in the mines and help build the Transcontinental Railroad. But by the 1870s, as the railroad was completed and the nation faced an economic downturn, anti-Chinese sentiment spread.
The idea really was, we really don't have jobs for these people anymore. And I think a lot of the racism against Chinese, even while they were there, got directed into laws. And Congress, in the United States Congress, enacted a law to keep Chinese laborers out. But as a practical matter, it meant cutting off the flow of Chinese immigrants.
California passed many anti-Chinese laws, but found that as a state, it didn't actually have the authority to regulate immigration.
The anti-Chinese movement is also operating at a time where many people in the world believed in racial difference. And this had been converted into a set of so-called scientific beliefs, which will come to be known as eugenics or race science.
Scientific eugenics was a concept formulated to falsely claim that some races were biologically superior to others. These ideas were used to justify racism, slavery, forced sterilization, and immigration restrictions at the time.
Chinese made easy targets because you could point to them as a race and attribute them with being too different, inassimilable, having a essentially different kind of culture and civilization, and therefore not participating in the United States as a democracy.
This led to widespread racism, violence, and laws that targeted and excluded Chinese workers. In 1882, Congress signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was a law stating that no more Chinese workers were allowed to immigrate to the US. The law was supposed to last 10 years, but kept being renewed. It wasn't fully repealed until 1943. Over 60 years later.
The Chinese restriction law is the only immigration law that identifies the targeted group by race for almost virtual exclusion. It also helps us to identify this turning point in U.S. national history when the U.S. goes from being a nation of unregulated immigration. People could just come, people could stay.
As the years progressed to the 1900s, legislation became stricter and Congress passed the Restrictive Immigration Act of 1917, which banned immigration from large regions of Asia and the Pacific Islands. It also required literacy tests for immigrants over the age of 16. President Woodrow Wilson vetoed the bill because he thought it was too harsh and discriminatory. But Congress overrode his veto, showing strong support for stricter immigration controls. Since immigration had risen to more than 6 million between 1910 to 1920, Americans thought about limiting immigration by a strict quota. In 1921, the US Congress passed a law known as the Emergency Quota Law of 1921.
We're going to set limits, said the legislators, on the number of people who can come from any country in the world except for the Western Hemisphere.
This did not apply to Mexico or Canada. Anti-immigrant sentiments, such as calling Southern and Eastern European immigrants parasites, were common among American politicians at the time.
The prosperity made possible by our forefathers has lured the parasites of Europe, the scum that could have so well been eliminated from the melting pot.
From the 1890s, Eastern Europeans had become the largest group immigrating to the US until Congress put a limit to it in 1921. The Emergency Quota Act was based on how immigrants could enter the country based on percentage. It allowed a limited number of people from each country to come to the US each year. The limit was 3% of the number of people from that country already living in the US, based on the 1910 census.
The basic idea is to try to preserve the racial composition of the United States as it existed at the end of the 1800s. In other words, the period to try to say, okay, the country has existed in the period from 1890 to 1910. That's the country we want.
It mostly had Southern and Eastern Europeans, like Italians, Poles, European Jews, and Greeks, because few of them were already living in the US. It favored Northern and Western Europeans, like the British or the Germans, who had been coming earlier and in greater numbers. But immigration restrictionists argued that Mexicans couldn't legally immigrate because they were ineligible for citizenship due to being considered mixed breeds. In 1924, an even harsher measure was put in place, the National Origins Act of 1924, which made the quota system permanent, reducing it to 2% and excluding Asians completely.
I found a theme that runs through all waves of attacks on immigrants, efforts to keep immigrants out, attacks on ethnic minorities, and it's often used as a tool to distract from other political things that are going on, from other tensions. And it's easier to try to get the middle class to blame other people who look different, who sound different, who come from other places, who eat different foods.
In the hearings leading up to the passage of these laws, a senator by the name of James D. Phelan claimed that Northern European races were much more assimilable than others.
We can make in a few generations a good American citizen out of a boy from France or England or Scotland or Ireland or Germany or Italy. Not so the black and brown and yellow races.
But the Act also exempted some countries from the quota system, effectively allowing unrestricted immigration from Latin America and other Western Hemisphere nations. The consequences of this law made immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe very limited. As a result, it solidified white dominance in US policy. As a result of this law, immigration numbers fell to less than 500,000 during the 1930s. The law also severely affected refugees fleeing World War II.
Another consequence was a reluctance to provide more visas for people when they're fleeing persecution and being threatened in Nazi Germany, but also elsewhere in the world. I think it's fair to say that the general "let's keep America an exclusive nation" to keep it as it existed in 1900.
The US allowed in only 127,000 German Jews between 1933 and 1940. But the US didn't fill its full immigration quota for Germany. Some 110,000 spots were left unused in the 1930s. If the quota had been fully used, many more Jews could have escaped Nazi Germany before the war. During World War II, the US started the Bracero program. It was an agreement with Mexico to bring in temporary farm workers called braceros. These workers helped fill labor shortages since many US men were drafted for war.
I have the greatest sympathy for the Mexican people, but the time has come when we must face up to facts. It is clear that the tide of illegal entry has become a serious problem.
From now on, Mexicans became the largest immigrant group. Immigration from Asia also increased, while immigration from Europe declined. More than 4 million Mexican workers came to the US under this program.
So the Bracero program ran for about 40 years, and through that, hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers would come to the United States every year, fully with the permission of the U.S. government, and most of those would remain in the United States until the crops were picked, that they were hired to come and work in.
At the same time, many Mexican workers came without papers because demand for cheap labor was high. Employers often preferred undocumented workers because they didn't have to follow the Bracero rules. By the 1950s, public concern grew about illegal immigration from Mexico. In 1954, the US government launched Operation Wetback, a mass deportation campaign to return immigrants back to Mexico.
So they were going after folks who spoke Spanish and who looked Mexican, but they weren't bothering to ask, are you a U.S. citizen or not? And so we know that many U.S. citizens, along with their Mexican citizen parents, were deported during Operation Wetback. That came in the middle of the 1950s.
Its goal was to remove undocumented Mexican immigrants, many of whom had been working in the US for years. More than 1 million people were deported or pressured to leave, sometimes even US citizens.
You encourage people to come to the United States, Mexicans specifically, to come to the United States to do this hard labor, but you don't want them to stick around. And the very idea that was said out loud in certain moments by high-ranking government officials was, we want Mexicans as workers, but we do not want Mexicans as neighbors. We do not want Mexicans as the children who are attending our schools.
The civil rights movement and the rejection of eugenics shifted public opinion against the national quota system, laying the groundwork for reform. In 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 would end the national quota system and replace it entirely with a preference system for immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere.
Certainly, there's often been preference given to immigrants with lighter skin. But we did see a big opening in the 60s, along with a greater move towards civil rights and inclusion.
After 1965, you stop having these national limits that were designed to preserve the racial composition of the United States as it existed in 1900. And so the immigration flows to the United States changed radically after 1965.
In the following decades, because of the Cold War, lots of refugees fleeing communism from Cuba, Vietnam, and Russia entered the US. In 1990, the US increased immigration caps to 700,000 per year. Up until the 2000s, even Republican politicians seemed to be open to immigration. In 2000, Republican presidential candidate George W. Bush appealed to Hispanic voters by supporting expanded legal immigration and legalization for illegal immigrants.
George W. Bush seems like the kind of person who would be dismissed. Frankly, by the current administration, he would be dismissed as someone who was way too permissive and in favor of legalization. And I think it's fair to say he would be branded by the current administration as an open borders type for being someone who was in favor of legalization.
However, the events of 9/11 became a major turning point.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
After 9/11, it was a very difficult and confusing time. Immigration became linked to security in a way that it had not been before. There were lots of challenges, particularly for South Asian, Arab, and Muslim immigrants.
The focus shifted towards identifying and deporting undocumented immigrants, particularly those from predominantly Muslim countries.
They say, well, we have to limit the number of immigrants because it's a national security issue, it's a public safety issue, because immigrants commit crimes.
There was a lot of data on crime. Actually, immigrants are less likely to be violent criminals or burglars or any of those sort of criminals than native-born Americans are, but Americans perceive that they are because that's what they've mistakenly read. And so I think there was a lot of fear, particularly around terrorism. But it's always been part of human nature that people are wary of people who look different, of newcomers. Most people don't like change. And so really attacking immigrants through rhetoric, through laws, through breaking laws has often been an all too easy trick for politicians to use.
Fast forward to 2009, Democratic presidential candidate Barack Obama advocated for the increase of sanctioning employers and legalization for immigrants with no criminal records. US President Barack Obama supported the DREAM Act, a bill to help young, undocumented immigrants who came to the US as children. The DREAM Act passed in the House of Representatives, but it failed in the Senate by just a few votes.
I think Obama's approach was to be forgiving and generous to people inside the United States, certainly to people growing up in the United States, also to people who had been living in the United States for a long time and who had been working, paying taxes, and being part of American society.
In 2012, Obama started DACA, which gave 2-year work permits and protection from deportation to young immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children.
It's not a permanent fix. This is a temporary stopgap measure that lets us focus our resources wisely while giving a degree of relief and hope to talented, driven, patriotic young people. It is the right thing to do.
He supported immigration reform and focused on deporting criminals, not families. Between 2009 and 2016, his administration deported more than 5 million people, with 3 million people on his first term and 2 million people on his second term. This was more than any previous US president at the time. But while he implemented one of the harshest immigration policies in US history, his actions also shielded undocumented immigrants who were brought to the US as children.
So it was really kind of a hard on the outside, soft on the inside type of an approach. And the reason he had to do this was because the only way that the Republicans would agree or led Obama to believe that Republicans would agree was to say, if you give me legalization on the inside, I will give you more border enforcement on the outside or against the outside.
And that is just crazy logic to me. It doesn't make any sense at all. So I think that, the Obama administration, I think there were a lot of removals. There were a lot of efforts to bring people in. And I think that that's a combination that Americans like to see. Higher wall, bigger gates.
But critics, especially from immigrant rights groups, argued that his policies were too harsh, particularly on undocumented immigrants with minor or no criminal records.
We see that under President Obama, the number of people who were being pushed through the immigration court system without legal counsel was actually fairly low. It was less than half of people who were being who were detained while going through immigration court system did not have access to legal representation.
But in 2015, things began to shift. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump said that he would put America first by denying entry to immigrants who, he argued, take American jobs, commit crimes, and represent national security threats.
I remember the first conversation that I had with my husband after that. In 2015, after this debate, I was like, what are we going to do?
Trump won the Republican nomination, beating Republicans who held more traditional positions on immigration by calling for a wall on the southern border, ending birthright citizenship, banning Muslim entry into the United States, and terminating DACA.
We're in the middle of a crisis on our southern border. The unprecedented surge of illegal migrants from Central America is harming both Mexico and the United States, and I believe the steps we will take, starting right now, will improve the safety in both of our countries.
Upon taking office, Trump issued multiple executive orders to stop the issuance of visas to immigrants and non-immigrants from several, mostly Muslim-majority countries, based on the assertion that they would threaten national security. So, while the history of US immigration policy isn't just a record of border control or economic strategy, it may reflect who was deemed fit to become American. And while it once promised freedom and opportunity to newcomers, now some of its own citizens are leaving in search of exactly that, finding meaning in other countries like Germany.
I can't imagine going back to the States, given my personal situation now. I can't imagine it happening, and also how things have changed with particularly the current administration. Basically, through brute force, he's taking away a lot of important rights that made me feel safe. That made me feel safe there, and right now I'm very worried about people I love who live there.
Currently, the debate on how the current Trump administration is handling immigration policies is heated, sparking protests all over the country. America has always been a nation of immigrants. There are more than 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the US.
Much of immigration policy involves a certain amount of theater. You know, the chest banging, the saying we're going to be tough, doesn't always match up with the numbers.
On the one hand, a lot of the American politics wants to take a hard line against illegal immigration. On the other hand, the economy doesn't seem to want to keep out these workers, and so the compromise is let them in, look the other way.
As always, it's complicated for every single administration.
Once in a while, and I think we're in one of these moments right now in the year 2025, I think we're now in a moment where the politics has turned in favor of deportation. But many of the people being deported are, in one way or another, integral to the American economy. That's the source of the dilemma we have in this country.
The debate over who gets to belong and on what terms remains far from over. I started this with trying to understand whether America's immigration policies have been racist. Based on the facts, race has played an important role on deciding who gets into the United States of America.